Wow, that was awesome, Nate. Thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions here. Um, so first off, from Farmer Zoomer Boomer, why is debt to GDP ration so important?
Well, it would be the same way that if you made $50,000 a year in your job, but you spent more than that, and in order to spend more than that, you had to borrow it at the bank, and so you borrowed 20 and 40 and 60, and eventually you owed the bank $200,000. That would be 400% debt to GDP. So if you owe the bank 200 grand and all you make is 50 grand, that can only be manageable if your interest rates are really low or you're friends with the bank manager. But there is no one that can bail out the central banks of the world. So if we could, Japan is over 500% debt to GDP. They've had zombie companies for a while that can't support their earnings, don't support their interest and debt unless the government helps them. So the issue is that if we continue to maintain consumption today by issuing more and more credit, eventually people won't believe that that credit will be paid back, and all of a sudden the credit magic wand stops. And at that moment, if you were the bank 200 grand and you were making 50 grand, you cannot buy anymore. You cannot borrow anymore. And not only that, but you're going to owe 20 grand in interest to the bank, so you're down to 30 grand. So it ends up eventually being a giant deflationary pulse to the economy, where there's defaults and all the prices come crashing down. Because we can create money, but we cannot create energy. And this is not known to most people because we've been swimming in this since you and I have been alive, Ivan. We've created more debt every single year that you and I have been alive. Actually, when you were 1 or 2 years old, that might not have happened. But since I've been alive, we've created more debt every year than we've grown our GDP. That's just unsustainable.
Okay, thanks, Nate. From Heidi Cass, please re-explain the term biophysical alchemy.
Well, biophysical is a type of economics that's biology and physics, but what it really means is it's tethered to the real world. So most people in our culture think that money is wealth, but money is just a marker for real capital. Social capital, which is our relationships and our networks. Built capital, which is our house or our cell phone or our tractor. Natural capital, which is the soil and the trees. And human capital, which is our skills and our knowledge. So biophysical alchemy is in a musical chairs game when the amount of financial claims existent will unlikely all be paid back, to use that financial capital ahead of time, to turn it into, to transmute via alchemy into real things, as an individual, as a community, as a nation, to invest in a different sort of future. It's basically biophysical alchemy is turning digits in the bank and linen in your pocket into real things that will help your future.
Okay, thanks. And I also want to, before we go on, encourage everyone to put in some more questions in the Q&A, which is the button in the lower center of your screen there. So I'd love to hear your questions. The next question is from Jeff Brown. I love the bullshit meter. And I wonder, with all our cognitive biases, what would be the best way to catch our own blindness?
Yeah, it's hard, right? So of all the topics I know, I probably know cognitive biases and the brain the best. And so when I confidently say something about the future, I check myself because I have to handicap that 99% confidence by a third because I'm human and therefore I'm delusional. I think learning about cognitive biases gives you empathy and a little bit of kindness for other people when they make mistakes or are very confident. It allows you to see the witch doctors we have on the national press briefings right now on this coronavirus. I think, I don't know that it's possible. I mean, we can't change who we are where we see a shadow as a burglar instead of a shadow. I mean, we make those errors all the time, but educationally, we need to have scientific filters on energy, behavior, ecology, and those have been lacking in our education system. I don't know how to do it, Jeff, but I think it's imperative that we head in that direction. Well, for instance, Europe has a better bullshit filter than we do on balance on a lot of topics. You know, some 2/3 of our population don't believe in evolution, and I think 90% in Europe do, as one example.
Okay, thanks. From Lorette, please share how you started the lecture regarding to educate, inspire, and enlist people.
Right. I think in order to influence the future, in order to respond to the crises we face, we have to see the right game board. We have to see how pieces fit together. We can't just look at climate change. We can't just look at poverty. We can't just look at renewable energy. We can't just look at racism or politics. We have to see how the picture fits together, and that we are headed for a smaller economy. We are headed for less goods and services per capita. But it doesn't have to be a disaster. Once basic needs are met, the best things in life are free. We're going to need help from the government in the near term. We're going to need help from each other, building community. I can see how this all unfolds relatively clearly. So what I want to do is educate more people about the real chessboard, where the pieces still look like chess pieces, but they're not. It's a new game entirely. And so what I want to do is not scare people away from that, because it is a scary story. I mean, this was a lot of intense stuff in this lecture. But to inspire people to, you know what, we're only alive for a short time. What better time to engage in these things, get off our ass, go meet your neighbors after lockdown and all that, et cetera. And enlist more and more of our society to play a role in this emergent future that we don't know what it's going to be like. So I'd rather have a lot more people trying different models, different ways of doing things, and a lot of those things might not work, but some of them will. And so that's what I mean by enlist.
Okay, thanks. From an anonymous attendee, I've been reading reports of fracking and well permits being approved in California and Texas in the last month. Does that mean that oil and gas companies are planning new investments?
Yes, I'm sure they are, and I don't know the legislative tax subsidy rule changes that are happening, but I can assure you that I talk to a lot of very smart energy gurus, and they're agreeing with me that we're at a point now where it almost has to be nationalized, unless we somehow miraculously have a V-shaped recovery, which I just think is impossible. We're not going to have a V-shaped recovery. First of all, this virus is going to, the reason that we had the declines in cases and deaths is because we've shut the economy down. As soon as we open the economy up again, we're going to get a second wave. So a V-shaped recovery, even in China right now, the thermal footprint of China is around 65% of where it was a year ago, despite them claiming that they're recovering and all back to work. They are back to work, but consumer spending is down dramatically. And the amount of coal and electricity they use is only at about 2/3 as it was a year ago. So I think it's a big unknown with fracking. And the thing is when you stop drilling for tight oil, your production declines 30 to 40%. So we're going to see massively sharp declines in production in the next year or two. And there's a lot of oil still left there, but it's costly. And remember the difference between price and cost. There's also a difference between cost and value, because 1 barrel of oil if it's $40 or $80 or $200, still does 4.5 years of my work. And we're going to need some of that to build the United States equivalent of Spanish paradors in the future. So here's another narrative that's happened that's very frustrating to me. I think the environmental movement has kind of been co-opted by techno-optimists and big business, and it's left its ecological roots from the 70s. And there's a lot of bullshit there too. There's actually a movement now, since oil is negative or so cheap, that environmentalists want to buy up all the fossil fuel companies and then just leave the oil in the ground. That is completely delusional, because our society we would be in Mad Max in a month if that happened. So we do need to nationalize the oil industry, but not to keep it in the ground, probably.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. I'm going to ask a question from me. So Nate, I know that you were very involved in the peak oil movement back in the early 2000s. You were one of the front runners on that. So what happened to peak oil? I'm not sure. I was distracted a little bit during your talk, and I'm not sure if you really covered why that didn't happen back then.
Yeah, well, so if you want to understand peak oil, you have to understand money. And if you want to understand money, you have to understand energy. If, in a hypothetical case, our culture would have disallowed debt, the debt would have been illegal. Can't imagine that, but if that happened, oil would have peaked in the 1970s. And we would have peaked and then had a lot of slow plateau and a slow decline. But since we were allowed to have debt, we kept borrowing and borrowing and building a bigger system. And so we accessed more oil, but the oil that we produced had a steeper decline rate, like Cantarell in Mexico. We had nitrogen injection and infilling and all these horizontal nipples, and we got this huge amount of production in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then it crashed. Well, that's akin to what's happening in shale, that we've already used the really low cost stuff, and now we're accessing the higher cost stuff, which has a much faster decline rate. So what happened, people were talking about 2005 to 2008 being peak oil, and we never pierced that on just conventional oil, which is the traditional conventional crude oil. Since 2005, we've been kind of on what's called a bumpy plateau. The increase in oil from 2005 was this shale oil, biofuels, natural gas, plant liquids, things that aren't really oil, but we count them as oil. And so what happened is the world went to debt and credit in a huge way in a response to the great financial recession in 2008. China issued $6 to $7 of credit for every additional dollar of their GDP. So China alone, since 2008, that credit alone accounted for 50% of the demand in the world for oil since the financial crisis. So what we did is we kicked the can of peak oil by growing the risk of finance. So we added more and more credit, and a lot of shale companies accessed Wall Street. But the larger story isn't the shale bubble per se, it's the entire human access to credit that allowed us to consume more the last decade at an eventual cost of a steeper decline rate of the underlying dynamics of the oil fields.
Okay, thanks. So, and there's several questions here that are kind of tie into the whole oil debt. And so from Farmers Boomer, so have-nots, you stated, have-nots are really going to suffer unless governments step up. So how? What more can they do? Surely not print more money. So I mean, in regards to that, how much debt can we get? I mean, how far can we go?
Well, here's the thing. We have a longer-term sustainability crisis for sure, and now it's been made worse. But we absolutely need to stabilize the patient, and I don't care what we need to do that, because there are systemic risks of connectivity and knock-on risks that I don't really want to get into here, but it's really a dangerous situation if we don't support people, companies, and the financial system. So how can we do more? We can have the government send little SNAP cards. We could even call them Trump cards to every American and have $500 a week or whatever it is, and you top those cards off electronically for as long as the crisis lasts. We're going to need things like that. We're going to need the Treasury, not the Federal Reserve. We're going to need the Treasury to make direct investments into companies that once the economy recovers, they can reverse those and sell them back. But the domino zipper effect of all these companies, for example, a company like Neiman Marcus, we don't really need all that fancy stuff at Neiman Marcus, but Neiman Marcus has a lot of employees. Neiman Marcus had a lot of companies that sell them things. Neiman Marcus bonds are owned by a lot of portfolio managers. If 1,000 companies like Neiman Marcus go under, it's this domino effect where the entire financial system implodes. And then we don't even have the ability to go buy things with our cash station cards because they no longer work. I mean, there's deep systemic risk if the government doesn't sufficiently bail out people, in my opinion. How much? Well, I mean, quite a bit, actually. I think Japan has been over 500% debt to GDP for a long time. They've been in this zombie deflationary wave since, more than 20 years, and they're still doing okay. It's definitely not sustainable, but I think we need to kick this last can, which then buys us a few years to do this biophysical alchemy and come up with plans, both as a nation and as communities, on living with less, having a more local, less materially intensive economy. But if we don't navigate these next couple months, we're not going to ever get to that point. So I think it's really important that the Federal Reserve and the government need to do more, need to do it faster, need to be more comprehensive, and they can't let anyone behind. There's a lot of people that were in the gray area between having jobs and not, that are completely left out of this right now, and we need to somehow support everyone. And I'm talking to people about this in DC, and I think people are starting to wake up to the magnitude of the problem. We need to do more, and it needs to be more comprehensive, not these waiting a month to get a check in the mail sort of thing.
Okay, good. From Elaine, what's a V-shaped recovery?
A V-shaped recovery is when the economy has a heart attack and drops 20% or 10% or whatever, and then we fix the problem. Like the coronavirus is cured, and all of a sudden everyone goes right back and to consuming exactly the way we were in December of 2019. So it looks like a V. I think it's going to be like an L, or like maybe like a C or a J. We will recover from this. The question is, what will the economy look like? What will be our goals? What will the financial claims look like? And how bad will it get first before the recovery? And I think, we have to be really careful about reopening the economies too soon. But even if, like Ivan, even if Governor Walz opened the economy again right now, wide open, would you go to a restaurant? Would you fly somewhere? So this is not only a physical thing, but a psychological memory that in the Great Depression, people were psychologically, there was a memory, the people that you knew that grew up in the Great Depression are really tight. They don't like to waste money because things were so hard in the 30s that every penny counted. So they're very frugal. Whereas you and I growing up, things weren't that hard, which is why we're spendthrifty on average, maybe not you. So I think this has already taken a little psychological toll on our population, and that of Europe and China and everywhere.
Okay, good. So a couple of questions here I'm going to combine because they're on similar topic. First, from Farmer Zoomer Boomer, from Drain America first to what? Drain Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. How about drain it not at all? And then as an aside, wouldn't it be politically and ecologically more implausible for the US to use that oil, say in 2100, if that's what you're saying?
Um, so the concept of my superorganism paper is that animals have a metabolism, and human economies, if you aggregate our large numbers of animals collaborating, working together, we also have a metabolism. So whatever happens with this coronavirus, we are going to self-organize around energy. Because energy is what is the veins and arteries and brings the hemoglobin to our society. So I think energy is going to be incredibly important in the next 20 years. And there needs to be a way to make it more costly. Because if we make it more costly, we're going to make better longer term decisions about it and its scarcity and how precious it is. The market system is not giving us those signals. The market system is going to say it's $10 a barrel for the next 3 years because the economy's in doldrums. So we have to have some emergent structure on top of that in order to make it more costly so that we make wiser long-term decisions. But we can't just leave it in the ground because it is vital to our country, our world. Now we're going to be using a lot less of it, which is why I think this coronavirus has completely lopped off the riskier RCP scenarios in the climate models. We're not out of the woods. In fact, if we stopped all fossil carbon and hydrocarbon burning today, we would still continue warming for decades because of whatever is built in the cake. But the really scary scenarios I've never thought were possible because of our inability to afford biophysically the last half or the last third of oil, natural gas, and coal. So I think what's happening is kind of good news for climate, assuming that we don't have a geopolitical response to this growth crisis, meaning a war or something like that, which could have bad outcomes.
Very
Bad
good.
for nature.
Yeah. Okay, from Lorette. Back in the day, how did you come to leave a financial institution like Salomon Brothers?
Well, I left Salomon Brothers because one of my female Korean colleagues in Hong Kong sold too risky of an instrument to a wealthy investor, and it cost the firm $4 million. And then the head of Salomon Brothers shut down our division. But I think that Loretta is asking more about why did I leave Wall Street? And the answer to that is that I started to read books by Herman Daly. I started to recognize that resource depletion, oil depletion, was a thing that was going to happen in my lifetime. I started to learn that the externalities, the negative prices, the negative impacts on the natural world were not included in our prices. And that just seemed so strange to me. And eventually I started reading books about the brain and ecology and human behavior and oil so much that I wasn't doing my day job that well. And so I gave my clients their money back, and I just started to read this stuff full time. To be honest, well, I'm always honest. To be blunt and open, I've spent 15 years piecing together this story of humans collectively acting as this energy-hungry superorganism. And I see that clearly now. And the question is can we be something other than that? And I think we have to understand what it is that we're doing and why in order to imagine and navigate towards better paths. Could we have some sort of governance? Could we have some sort of cultural metric beyond just GDP? If we're like the people in the movie Idiocracy, the answer is no, because we want to get these feelings, and the feelings are correlated with energy, and the energy is correlated with fossil carbon, which has CO2. But a lot of the feelings we can get, oh, by the way, don't need all that energy. When I'm with my dog, that little Frank, where is Frank? Frank, come here, I'm talking about you. Frank, come here. Frank is a tiny little animal. Come here, Frank. I'm talking about you. Up, come on. Wow. Here he is, Frank. Frank hardly needs any money or food, a little bit of kibble every night. And how much serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine do I get from this little man? Right? Right? So I don't know if that answered your question.
Good, good, thanks.
That's something I never could have done at the Rochester church, by the way.
Okay. Question from Scott Endler. How can we encourage those that have had the good fortune to do well in the previous economic free market system to feel compelled to step up and contribute more with progressive income taxation and wealth taxes to begin to provide a minimum basic income in order to maintain social coherence?
It's an excellent question. It might be the question in coming years. First of all, we have to have the government started. The government has to support all people now. How do you get people that did well in the last 30 years or whatever to help out? I think, to be honest, the only way is if they're going to fear that their money's not going to be worth anything and that they won't have a society to spend it on. And that's a real risk, I think. So they have to be educated and aware of how all these pieces fit together. And they have to have some empathy and pro-social views to begin with. But as you know, this coronavirus was a medical issue, but it laid bare inequality, finance, energy, all kinds of other problems. But the biggest problem it laid bare is our political situation. We are in such a vitriolic battle between the left and the right that I'm afraid that we won't do what's necessary in May when we have this new 2020 coronavirus TARP moment, that the political will isn't there to go across the aisle and do what's right for the country. But to Mr. Endler, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's really central. Maybe we have to explain to people absolute versus relative wealth. It's a really difficult thing to do because there's also the psychological cognitive bias called loss aversion, which is if you start with $10,000 and you make it to 11,000, and then they measure your brain chemicals and how happy you are, and then you lose 1,000 and go from 11,000 to 10,000, and they measure your brain and interview you. You feel much worse after losing the 1,000 than you do after gaining the 1,000. We are averse to losses because a little bit extra food in our ancestral environment wouldn't have meant much, but a week without food meant you would die. So right now, a lot of people are experiencing subjective and monetary loss, and they don't feel good about it. So on top of that, say you need to support other people that don't have it as well as you is a difficult conversation, but I think it's an important one.
Okay. So this next question is kind of a two-part. So it's from Jeff Brown. Thank you for the radical reframing. I especially liked consumer to humans, people, and collapse to decline, bend, simplify. Can you share some ways you have done these in your own life? And as a follow-up, he goes on to say, please know that my question about reframing is with the intention that Nate can show some day-to-day examples for people. I'm not questioning Nate or his obviously integrity.
Well, I mean, the consumer to human is an easy one. I used to make a lot of money back in the day. I haven't really had a job in 15 years. And I lived off my savings for a while, and then I do some consulting and some teaching, and I get paid in things not in dollars, but in, Ivan, you're not paying me to do this call, but I'm getting neurotransmitters because I'm trying to help humanity. I'm getting a feeling that I'm passing the baton of what needs to happen in our culture to other people. That feels meaningful to me. I'm not a consumer. I'm a human. I'm a citizen in doing that. Lots of examples where you have a choice of going to a fancy trip or a restaurant, but instead you make a simple meal at home. These last few weeks, we've been drawing down our freezer instead of going to the grocery store. And I think the grocery store would be fresher and better food, but we're trying to get rid of the things in the freezer. So there's lots of examples like that. As far as collapse versus bend or break, like I said earlier, I view the world as a probability distribution. There is a possibility of collapse. Anyone studying this knows that is true because we live in a complex system and there's lots of moving pieces. First of all, I've already processed that. So I think that's maybe a 20 or 30% chance. And I deal with that and I try to increase the 70 to 80% chance of it not happening because I think we need to bend and not break. And if we get to that next bend, then some new thing might happen, some new technology, some new ethic, some new meme with young people. We don't know what the future is going to be. We could probably be confident about what it's not going to be, and it's not going to be unbridled economic growth the next decade. So I just think we have to keep, keep fighting and do these things in our own life where we don't consume just because we can. Partially because that trains us to be more resilient when things will be more expensive and more difficult. Partially because it sends a message to others. Wow, look at that Jeff guy. He doesn't consume a lot. Look how healthy and happy he is. He's smiling all the time. I want to be like him. What's he doing? We haven't had the chance to have that cultural example because everything is Kanye West and Kardashians and TV shows. And now we're having examples of how real people are responding and living. And by the way, Kanye West emails Forbes to say, you undercounted my wealth. I'm worth 3 billion, not 1 billion. I mean, what a cultural, iconic example of exactly not the direction we want to be headed, as an aside.
Very good, thank you. Heidi Cass is wondering, could you talk a little more about needing warriors and mystics?
Well, I'm a scientist, so I usually talk in charts and graphs and things like that. And there's a lot of things. I mean, science really is pattern recognition at the end of the day. But there's a lot of unspoken things that you don't need a scientific explanation. And frankly, I think we eventually will need a technocracy of some sort, which is systems literate scientists making plans for a descent, a viable descent in our future. But we need, before we get to that point, we need storytellers or warriors and mystics. We need people out there that are artists explaining to others the best things in life are free once you have your basic needs met, explaining the importance of nature, explaining the authentic community and how important that is. And so you don't need to be this practical dot the I, cross the T scientist to influence the future. You can take your own path, which I summarized as warriors and mystics, as just someone who's passionate about the world, about our future, choosing their own way to engage with these things. Ivan, you're on mute.
Oh, yep, okay. I had to get a glass of water. Suzanne Derby, I know is from Rochester here, and she is wondering, I appreciate your proposal to nationalize the oil. How can we do that without a social and probably violent revolution, given how private industry wants to hold on to profits? For example, New York Times covered how children of oil now identify as energy producers as opposed to oil producers. I doubt they want to be nationalized.
Well, I mean, generally, yes, but they're not making any profits now. So I think it's a very real question that I'm really not an expert on how it would happen. But at the prices right now, no one is making money. Now, if we go back up to $20 or $30, most will not be making money, some will. But not only does it make sense, but it actually, if you've got someone with skills, of course, and that's the other problem, is the government could mismanage it worse than the companies are. But if you had the right people doing it, you would actually be able to extract more oil, do it on a better timeline. And in my opinion, I think in coming decades, we're going to have rationing in this country. And yes, that's not a free market statement, but let's be honest, we do not have a free market, and we haven't for a long time. The Federal Reserve and the central banks of the world are managing the levels. They have to support the amount of financial claims that are extant in the system dwarf the amount of actual productive capacity and resources. And as long as people look to the Federal Reserve, there was always this thing called the Powell put or the Bernanke put or the Yellen put, which meant that if the stock market went down enough, people knew that the central bank would come and do quantitative easing, which adds liquidity to the system. And the liquidity does not go to Main Street. It goes primarily to banks that then have to put that into financial assets. So the financial market now, we've rallied like 30% off of the lows. That's not because the economy is getting better. It's because the Federal Reserve came out with bazookas to support and buy things like junk bonds. I don't know the answer. I just see, what I see is the problem. And the problem is having all these oil companies come out of this, given the economic landscape I see, they're not going to be able to. So they're going to need help. Otherwise, the entire industry is going to collapse. And the only help I can see is Federal Reserve or the Treasury giving them huge amounts of money or some sort of nationalization. But the money isn't really going to help the situation unless we somehow get back to 60, 70, 80, 90, $100 oil, which the global economy is not going to support, not remotely. So it is a pickle. And I'm looking into it. So I'll get back to Ivan with what I find out.
All right, thanks. This next question is, something that, when I first met you several years ago, Nate, I was not in agreement with you because I was a techno-optimist, but I've been reformed since then by you. So from anonymous attendee, I completely agree with you on techno-optimism. But what is the best way to persuade people that technological innovation is not going to save us?
You need to do a lot of reading and a lot of understanding. We've been alive in an era where we've mistaken abundant net energy for cleverness. And cleverness is what people say has gotten us through this. It's like every maze has cheese at the end. And if that's the case, then of course we're clever enough to find the cheese. But the net energy, which is how much energy we use, we get after we spend the energy and materials to get it, are what really drives society. Technology in many ways is just a vector for how much energy we will require next year. So if we invent some new things, a Nintendo Switch or a new microwave or a new lawnmower, then there's more demand for that next year. We've never had a decline in energy, really, to show the relationship between energy and technology. But if oil declines, continues its decline, and I argue that it peaked in October of 2018, we're going to see what technology can provide for us. So most technology just uses energy to give us the feelings that the technology produces. It's a difficult thing to convince to people, but you have to read about ecology and energy and nature and the concept of net energy. I mean, I know it's difficult because I've spent 15 years trying to do it and I've not made it that far. But you could read my superorganism paper called Economics for the Future Beyond the Superorganism. It's freely available online. And here's another suggestion. I made a 1 hour and a 5 hour short course of my Reality 101. It's called The Human Predicament short course online. And then there's a full 36 5 or 6 minute videos. And in there is an hour and 45 minutes on energy and technology and money, well before the coronavirus, but it's all still quite valid. You could find that on just a Google search on YouTube.
Okay, good. And Nate, we're coming up on 3 o'clock. We can keep going. We got, pretty much everybody still online. So I'll let you decide when when you're ready to.
Well, I had already committed to going on a bike ride, although it looks to be threatening. Is it raining down in Roch or not?
No, but it looks threatening.
Yeah. No, I'm going to try to get a bike ride in. So maybe one more question and then we will carry on.
Okay. Let me pick between these two then.
Well, if there's two, you can do two.
Okay, I'll give you these two. The first one is from Jeremy Emmy. I like your idea of real assets as opposed to money, financial instruments. How do you create liquidity, which most people will need, if capital shifts to real assets? E.g., if your retirement is in the form of a share of a farm or office building or trees.
Well, I mean, that's a good retirement plan to have. The myth of barter is we never really did trade a chicken for a wheelbarrow or things like that. So that's why money is so important, is because there's liquidity. You're not going to have liquidity on a farm. But my point was, if you don't have a farm and you don't have land and you don't have equipment and you don't have friends and you don't have skills and you have a big 401k, the time is to get out of that financial marker of reality and get into some real reality. But yes, you will then have less liquidity, but liquidity shouldn't be the end goal. The end goal should be sustainability and a good life and a community.
Good. And then the last one then from Andrew Bolu. Thanks for giving this talk. On your statement about there not being enough affordable fossil fuels to cause really bad climate change scenarios, what is your estimate for the amount of affordable fossil fuels out there?
I didn't say there wasn't enough to cause really bad climate change. I said it wasn't enough to reach the RCP 8.5 or the RCP 6 or even the RCP 4.5 scenarios. We don't know what's going to happen. There are a lot of biological feedbacks that are already kicked in. I just have been more sanguine about some of these hysterical books that are out, that it's too late and we're off to the races. I think, like I said before, we live as part of a system. You can't just look at how much coal and oil is under the ground and say, oh, we're going to access that. Because what happens if China can never get back to the credit engine that they were? What happens if global trade, because of some sort of geopolitics, kind of breaks down? What happens if this virus lasts for years? There's all kinds of nonlinear impacts. In that case, I believe there's a 50% chance we will never, as a global economy, get to the 2019 level of energy use, which is 17.5 trillion watts, 17 terawatts of energy. But we could recover, we could get things going again and pierce the 2019 level. But if we do that, we're still doing that because of a pop in debt to GDP, which means we'll only have a few more years before we have this natural financial recalibration. I don't have estimates in front of me, but I have talked to a lot of people about it who are biophysically literate. I think there's a decent chance that if the models are correct, that we do stay below 2 degrees Celsius, which means there's a 50% chance we don't. So I think climate and ocean acidification is the single biggest risk of our lifetime. But in our brains, it's not going to be a big risk because people are going to be worried about food and jobs and safety and security. And I think this virus pretty much took the wind out of the sails of the climate movement, not only because of the things I said, but because a lot of climate activism isn't going to be funded anymore because we're going to be in a recession or depression. But that doesn't mean it's not a risk. I just think the risk is now less than it was a few months ago.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nate. Farmer Zoomer Boomer had several more.
It's got to be someone I know.
But this has really been awesome. In this uncertain times, it's really much approved. And thank you, Mayor Norton, for your introduction and talking about Rochester a little bit. So, yeah, thanks again, Nate. Have a good bike ride.
Thanks, Ivan. Thanks for everything you're doing down there in Olmsted County. Talk to you soon, man.
Bye now.